The U.S. is strengthening its ties to Saudi Arabia. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with the Saudi Arabian defense minister in Washington. She highlighted the importance of a strong relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. However, Saudi Arabia is one of the worst persecutors of Christians in the Middle East. Just last month, the country's leading cleric called for the destruction of all Christian churches on the Arabian Peninsula. And joining us now to talk more about religious freedom in Saudi Arabia is Cliff May. He's the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Cliff, in a recent column, you point out that if a Christian leader had called for the destruction of mosques, there would have been a global outcry. Why was there no response when this Saudi Arabian leader called for destruction of churches?
Well, I'm totally mystified, although not quite surprised, that the mainstream media, the major media, would not want to pick up on that they would simply ignore that. I think that's a real dereliction of duty. For diplomats, for government officials, well, it's more complicated. They're trying to maintain good relations with the Saudis, and if they start to complain about things like that, that'll complicate those relations, so they don't do it. But the media really have a responsibility, it seems to me, somebody who comes from more than 20 years in the media, to report that, even if it's inconvenient to a lot of people.
Well, Saudi Arabia will not allow Christian churches, but isn't it financing the spread of Wahhabi Islam throughout the world, including the U.S.?
Yes. Wahhabi Islam, which is a very, very, I guess you would say, ultra-Orthodox version of Islam, which comes from Saudi Arabia. Only about 1% of the world's Muslims are Wahhabis, but the Saudi kingdom has probably spent more money spreading Wahhabism around the world, including the U.S., including Europe, Asia, everywhere, than the Soviets ever spent to spread communism. And so you have mosques around the world, again, including many here in the United States, that are funded by Wahhabis, funded by the Saudis, with Wahhabi imams and Wahhabi literature and scripture and doctrine. It's having a huge impact on the Islamic communities around the world, and has for quite a few years.
How are Christians treated in Saudi Arabia?
Well, Christians may not have churches. It is illegal for Christians to worship. Sometimes they'll turn a blind eye to it if it's done privately in the sort of ghettos that are established for, and sometimes nice ghettos, sometimes not, for foreigners, but you can be arrested for it. If a Saudi citizen wanted to convert to Christianity, that would be a capital offense. They could easily be sentenced to death. And of course, there are no, as I say, there are no churches, and what is somewhat new is the Grand Mufti, which is the supreme religious authority and part of the government in Saudi Arabia, is saying, well, there really can't be churches not just in Saudi Arabia, but anywhere on the Arabian Peninsula. This comes from a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, and therefore, if there are churches in Kuwait, as there are, for example, or in the United Arab Emirates or anywhere else in that kind of region, and it's not quite sure how he defines the region, but the peninsula writ large, they probably shouldn't be there, should never have been allowed in the first place, and yes, they should now be demolished. To not demolish them is to approve of them. To approve of them is to approve of blasphemy, and that would be a terrible sin.
Real quickly, what can be done to encourage the Islamic kingdom to allow more religious freedom?
Not a whole lot. There can be pressure, and there can be attempts at persuasion, but the Saudis are the Saudi royal family, they're much more afraid of being accused of being too friendly with the infidel world, which, and by the way, taking infidels as friends to a Wahhabi, that itself is a sin. They're much more afraid of the terrorists than they are of anything we can do or that we can say. There have been some reforms. It's getting a little looser, perhaps, for women. There's talk of women being allowed to drive and hold more jobs. It hasn't quite happened yet. We'll have to see what happens after there's a succession. The current king King Abdullah is quite old. We may get a more conservative king. We may get less so. There is not a lot we can do. The most important thing we should be doing is getting rid of our dependence on oil as a strategic commodity, so we're not as beholden to the Saudis as we are right now.
Indeed. Cliff May, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
To find out how you can help the persecuted church, check out our Christian World News webpage. There you'll find links to several groups, including the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Find it all at cwnews.org.